Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to come and present here this morning. In addition to those announcements there, I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm the chair of Brick Housing, which is a community housing organisation that does a lot of work with Indigenous people as well. So the majority of housing across Australia is delivered by the private sector, around 95%. And today, Neil asked me to come along and just set the scene, particularly from this broader ecosystem. And I'd have to say, after working in this space for over 25 years, it's probably one of the most complex ecosystems I'm involved in compared to other sectors, from a political, policy and regulatory perspective. So if you do find it hard navigating through it, I completely understand why. So I am going to touch on a little bit of the current state of play, what housing is doing from a production perspective, what some of the planning and regulatory initiatives and reform processes are, and what's happening on the ground, which we all know is not good at the moment. First of all, production rates. And can everyone see? Do you want me to stand back? Can you see it over here? Yep, you're good? Okay, fabulous. So actually, I am going to take the microphone. Is it on? Yeah, excellent. This is much easier to walk around. So what you can see here is the current production rates for dwelling completions across Australia. And of note is that we sit around between 150,000 and 200,000, on average around 180,000. That's a really important point that I want you to remember as I track through these slides. Over here you can see that production broken down by state, particularly the dwelling completions here, seeing that New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland take the most stock out of the system. And then up the top you can see that we did a little bit of a forecasting around 23 to 24 numbers and you can see that that production is on a decline, which we all know is currently happening. So at the moment, around 180,000 on average dwellings we create across the nation per year. New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria take the share, and our production is in a contracting environment. From a social housing perspective, I wanted to just touch on this as well. There are around 446,000 dwellings that are allocated to social housing, and that number has declined from 341,000 to 290 in 2023. And just a break up between what's public, community, state-owned and managed, and Indigenous housing corporations, of which are the lowest percentage of share across the social housing ecosystem. I also wanted to touch on social housing as a percentage of total stock. And as you can see here, we currently sit at around 4.1% of all social housing of the total stock. It's also broken down into the different states, and it is a pretty poor figure. Comparatively, internationally, we know that some nations 20%, particularly in the United Kingdom, and then you have some of the Europeans that are sitting nearly up at 50% of their stock in social housing. What we have contributed in addition between census is an additional 1,470 dwellings created within that 5-year period, which isn't much. And then the number of applications on the waiting list is around 174,000, and some of those figures where you get households in stress is around 377,000. So a lot of pressure on the system. So what does that mean? And these are the latest results from the National Supply Council report, which Neil actually sits on. And I highly recommend having a look at that report if you haven't had the chance. It's extremely comprehensive and paints a very real picture around, I suppose, what the government is trying to do from an initiative perspective, but what we're actually seeing and what the barriers are to achieving the results on the ground. And what we can see is that the actual dwelling completions and new demand is not aligned at the moment. As we said, we've got completions stagnating, and actually they are sitting around, as we said, under the 180,000. And we are actually what I call in the pit at the moment of contraction in supply. So we're actually in negative territory where supply is not meeting demand. And we're not anticipated to come out of that space until around 26, 27. But that still is subject to the dynamic environment that we're in around construction prices, labour issues, and competing markets as well. So the picture is that we're still not producing enough. Our demand is still high. It is intended to plateau as we move through, and we're actually in the negative territory for a few more years. So we're not there yet around seeing a better picture in relation to housing stress. The other element to this and how it results is the affordability aspect. And I think Neil's going to talk about a little bit more on the rental component. So I'll just talk around the capacity to afford purchasing. And we can see that significant decline across the nation around the percentage of people that are eligible or have the capacity to purchase. So we've gone from around 30 to 40% of the market down to around 11% of the market. What that means is that has ripple effects across. So those that can't purchase are now participating more in the rental market. And driving prices up, and they're pushing those that were perhaps traditionally able to rent out into the pressure of homelessness. So that's, I suppose, the current state around production. And then we have some significant announcements around reform initiatives to address the crisis that I wanted to touch on. So the National Housing Accord target, of course, it's set 1 million homes to start with. The Prime Minister last year added in another 200,000, so it's 1.2 million homes for 2029, and he incentivised that additional amount as well to the states, so that there is a payment system if you actually meet your targets by the 2029 date. So the states are now trying to work hard in actually putting that into effect. As I said, it's a $3 billion performance-based incentive that is applicable when those dwellings are completed. And there's also, there was an initiative around the $2 billion Social Housing Accelerator Fund, which has been referred to the states already, and they're putting that to work at the moment. What does that mean then for annual targets across the nation? And this is, it's the actual breakdown per state for that 1.2 million. And these are the figures that each state needs to produce each year to meet that target. And as this is around 220,000 dwellings per annum, and we only produce around 180, as I said. So we actually are disconnected between what the target is trying to achieve and the production rates on the ground of around 40 to 50,000 dwellings at the moment. So we conducted a review of the performance of the planning systems across the nation for the Federal Treasury Department. It's an action that is in the National Housing Accord. And these were some of the key observations that were made around what are the current barriers to achieving the housing outcomes on the ground. One of them is around land and dwelling supply and the conversion of this. So local governments, as Tom said, are very key on the ground about getting more housing, and they do zone the land. But what we're seeing is that they might zone the land, but the ability then to actually convert that into an assessment application, because it might have infrastructure issues, those sorts of things are still acting as a significant barrier. There's also the alignment and delivery of infrastructure as well, and we can see that there have been a range of incentive programs here in Queensland and nationally around trying to drive what they call last mile infrastructure, so being able to be eligible for funding to get that sewer or that road network to help unlock the land. A significant lack of diversity, dwelling diversity. It is increasing slightly, but we tend to just have the apartments, the townies and the houses, and we need a much more sophisticated portfolio of dwelling types to actually meet the needs of our community as they age in place, as Tom has said as well. And less housing, as I said, has been approved. So actually we have some of the lowest numbers of dwelling approvals in the last decade currently in play, which is still to wash through the system as well from a supply perspective. And assessment timeframes are getting longer. So trying to get an approval is getting harder and costing more. And as we said, construction delays and costs are also affecting viabilities of proposals, which is causing less to be built as well. So it's not a great picture from, I suppose, the planning system barriers that are at play. And what happened was that the Prime Minister announced in August last year a planning reform blueprint, and planning has been, I suppose, called one of the most significant barriers to housing delivery. And there are a range of recommendations that the Minister announced that are required to be addressed by each of the states. And it's important to remember that planning controls and planning and development sits with states and local governments, not necessarily the feds. So this is currently with all of the states around the nation, and we can see that many of them are doing a range of initiatives to actually put it into effect, like fast-tracking approvals, like updating their planning instruments, looking at high density in well-located areas, and we can see Melbourne and Sydney have recently done some heavy lifting in that space, doing adequate resources to assess applications, reforming the delivery of rapid and social and affordable housing. I wanted to pause on this one slightly because what I call the sugar hit has happened across the system, and we've seen short-term, significant, blunt instruments used to get volume for housing, but I'm yet to see the long-term embedded provisions around social and affordable housing. And it's a really important element because it's actually where, particularly for Indigenous housing, where the potential to get the most supply and the most effect will come. And it's really important that you advocate, as Thomas said as well, to both state and local government and actually co-design what this looks like from a planning system perspective. So what does social and affordable housing within planning across our state look like from a regulatory perspective, and how do we actually put that into effect? What we are seeing is that what we have, what we call mandatory inclusion provisions, which means that when a development comes to be put on land, it has to actually have a mandatory component of social and affordable housing. Now, the who and the what of that is what is, I suppose, yet to be determined. We've seen the HAF try and achieve that with the investment mandate, where there are a range of priority groups. But it's important that when proposals are coming through where inclusionary provisions are getting put into statutory instruments, that there's opportunities for Indigenous housing corporations to partner to actually deliver more stock into these areas. And that's the pathway that will mature over the next 5 to 10 years. And it's not just for Indigenous, but it's for all priority groups and for all community housing providers potentially. I did want to touch quickly just on all of the funding initiatives. I won't go through them specifically, just to say that it's an extremely busy space. I've never seen so much money fall into this sector at the moment across a whole range of initiatives. Particularly wanted to touch on the HAF. And the recent announcements around the HAF and the interesting aspects to that. We are seeing not many of the priority groups achieving success in that space, and also a lot of additionality, particularly into the Sydney and Melbourne markets in the first round. And then also just the other initiatives around the CRA, where there's been changes, the better deal for renters, and the BTR. And of course, we've still got some legislation coming back into Parliament this week as well to see if it gets over the line around the shared equity pathways to ownership. Again, the Housing Accord, as I've said, is the national framework that we're all working with around reforms across the system. It's a tripartite agreement and also with the not-for-profits and business sectors. And there's a whole range of initiatives in there and actions which are flowing through at the moment. And then there's a national agreement on social housing and homelessness as well, which has been spoken about already. So, just drawing to a conclusion, and this is the new Minister, Claire O'Neill, and she has highlighted that we don't just have one crisis, we actually have three, and it is around supply, which I've spoken around, and it's around the affordability element, but also the other factors at play, which are labour and productivity as well. And they're not going to go away. So supply is being addressed, and that'll also help affordability, but the labour and productivity aspects are the most difficult to actually deal with currently. And just some observations before I hand over to Neil around what I've seen, and particularly working with a range of Indigenous housing organisations currently. We are seeing inconsistency in planning reform across the nation. So Queensland here has quite a very good planning system, probably the nation leading. But some of our reform initiatives probably haven't gone as far as other states like New South Wales and Victoria. So we're actually seeing inconsistency across the reform agenda. That also plays into simple things like definitions as well, which we all grapple with, like what's a definition of affordable housing? And I think there's room for improvement there, and hopefully the National Housing and Homelessness Plan, which is still in draft, may, if we wish hard enough, try and address some of those issues as well. The element between the relationship between the funding criteria and the feasibility, we have seen a lot of those feasibilities, and the market does this, takes the easiest path or the path of least resistance. And I think that actually things like the investment mandate for HAF hasn't really been successful with the priority groups as much as perhaps as what it should have. And I think there's an opportunity there for a review of that and for advocacy on your part around making sure those priority groups and the investment mandate align to get the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. As I said, that funding program and priority groups. The other one was the capacity for housing organisations to participate. And I had been speaking with Treasury and Housing Australia when we were working with proponents, and we could see that the capacity to participate is very different for Tier 1s, Tier 2s and Tier 3s, and particularly with an Indigenous focus. There needs to be a lot greater support systems and also the way submissions need to be put together. The simplification of that is critically important for the success for those priority groups as well moving forward. So I think advocacy there, if I'd put a point down, that would be a big one for you guys to actually put as a high priority. And the other one, I think, is important to realise that the regional, rural and remote needs need to be factored in, and how you do that from a criteria that's assessing these funding rounds, whether it's a multiplier factor, all those sorts of things, whether it's to deal with the additional cost or actually particular geographies having that greater need, and might not be volume, but it might be essential, needs to be factored into more greatly than it has been from proposals being assessed as well. So I think there's lots of learnings from particularly the programs and the reform system. I think There needs to be stronger advocacy, particularly from First Nations into this space. We're not seeing the results, I don't think, or the prioritisation that needs to happen, and keen to hear more about that over the conference and how you might do that back towards the governments. So with that, I'll hand over to Neil.
The reason why we had Julie talk at the beginning of this is we've got to put this all into context. Housing is very complex. Many of you know, you work in this area, you're practitioners in some way or another informed in housing. It's not an easy problem to fix. Now you can see the problems that we have with housing before we even talk about Indigenous housing. So we've got issues around supply, we've got issues around labour, someone's got to pay for it all. How much do you think it would cost us to build 180,000 houses a year, if that was the target? Anyone got an idea? A couple of $100 million? A couple of billion? Yeah, we're in the tens of billions of dollars to build that sort of number of houses per year. So it gives you an idea that this isn't an easy fix, and there's got to be some money made available to be able to help us with that, and also to lever developers and others. So we'll unpack a bit of the housing stuff later, because I don't think people see those big figures. The fact that we're talking about 180,000 houses being built and completed per year, yet we're only sitting at about 160 completions, is a problem for us, because we've got to play catch up at some stage to be able to achieve some of these ambitious targets that are in front of us. And it's not an easy way by any means. But what I want to talk about is highlighting and building on a little bit of that, just give you a snapshot. So Julie's giving you the broader issues around housing itself and the housing system and the challenges that we've got with housing supply. But for some of you who are non-Indigenous or may not work really closely in the Indigenous space, I just want to give you some baseline data, so everyone's got the same information. Now, as we unpack over the next couple of days, home ownership, homelessness, community housing, we'll go into a lot more detail about some of these figures and what it looks like. But I'm just going to start off with some headline facts that we talk about often. One is not as many people who are First Nations own houses as non-Indigenous people. So non-Indigenous people are about 68%. Of those dwellings are owned by non-Indigenous people. For us, it's a lot lower. It's about 42%, and we're seeing increases in that. But they're important, and I'll talk about that a little bit later throughout the next 2 days. We've got issues around social housing. For a group of people who sit out about 4% of the population, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people represent almost 20% in social housing, which is significantly high. We've got issues around overcrowding that we haven't been able to fix, and some of those figures will change over a period of time, but to be honest, in the areas where we need to fix it, it's really expensive, so we haven't come up with solutions and we haven't found the funds to fix the problem in those areas. And I'll touch on that in a short while in the next session. And then we've got the challenge around homelessness, and there's people like David Pearson and others in the room who talk about this idea of zero homelessness, and we've got to get to accepting that concept. Many of you who may have worked in industries over a period of time may remember when we introduced workplace health and safety into workplaces, and we got to a point in the mining industry where we have zero harm. So it's an expectation now that no one gets killed or hurt on a mine site. Yet we haven't adopted that necessarily in the housing space, and the people like David and others who are advocates for it, it's a really good notion for us to think about that. All right, so the slide's got a lot of boomerangs in it, but the issue is that we've been doing the same thing for a long period of time and we haven't really got any different results. So we've actually got to stop now and just take stock and say, yeah, we've tried that, it hasn't worked, we've been doing that for a while, it really hasn't made an impact, and we've got to upset and disrupt what we're doing to see real changes in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing. The notion of sitting here and saying that we just need more money to do this doesn't work. Sometimes it's a shift of the resources that are available and a different prioritisation. I've spoken about the dysfunction around really some leadership that's let us down, and that we've got to actually change that and challenge that leadership that's in there. But let's talk about a couple of things. There's external factors that impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing that we really can't control. And some of those things are like what Julie had spoken about before. The issue of supply, while we're fighting for it, we're advocating for more supply, we want all those things to be fixed. The reality is some of that won't be fixed overnight. And we're not going to see the number of houses that we need materialise and just happen because we haven't worked out the supply stuff. The access to housing is still a big issue. Racism is still around, and people who don't say that should put a dark-skinned person in front of someone and ask them, is racism still here in this country? Now, in the housing space, people have been excluded from housing for a long period of time. We've had a history in different sectors where they've actually marginalised First Nations people, and those sort of things have to be addressed. And it's not something that black people should just fix. It's a broader system issue within society, and some of those are structural issues. The data and information that we need to get better outcomes around housing are flawed from the start. You put rubbish into a computer, it spits out rubbish. The data sets that we need to actually know exactly what we need are flawed. And I'll use that as an example when we talk about housing a bit later on. We need to know the breakdown of what we're looking at and who we're trying to house. And this has been a real big problem. We can say overcrowding looks like this, we've got this number of people. It doesn't mean that for every house that's overcrowded, we need one more house. We need to have a look at who's contributing to overcrowding and what is the breakdown and what does that look like? Do we need more 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, all that? But our data is so flawed and generic at the moment that it makes it incredibly hard for us to do that. So then we come up with these notions where people will say, oh, I need these houses, when in actual fact we build them, but we're still in the same issue of overcrowding because we built the wrong houses. Issues that we can't control are things like climate change. So unfortunately affects a lot of our First Nations communities, Torres Strait and other island type communities, Palm Island, others, where over a period of time we will see water rise, and that'll mean that our zoning changes. So I know Palm and others have done some work around this, but working out where you can actually build houses so you're prepared for in the future as the ocean rises. Those things aren't in our control. The other thing isn't in our control is things like natural disasters, and while we don't have a lot of earthquakes in this country, we do have in some locations, but more prevalent are weather events like cyclones and things like that. What we can't control is the fact that we have to have cyclone rating in some areas where we have cyclones that add to the cost of building something. So we have tie downs on our roofs so they don't blow off in a cyclone, all those sort of things. So there's a lot of things outside of our control. The housing quality, if some people are building houses and they want to build X number of houses with a certain bucket of money, that impacts on sometimes quality. Many of you will hear a little bit later on that of the houses that have been built over a period of time in Indigenous communities, at least 30% of those have major structural flaws, which for us to go in and repair those, there are significant costs to whoever's funding to do those remedial works, where we should have built a different style of house in the first place. So some of those things need to be taken into consideration. And the last one is the overcrowding. The fact is that in some of our communities we have people, because there is no land availability or there is not enough dwellings, that it forms overcrowding. We weren't put in these communities. We might live in those communities, but there is an expectation as we talk about inclusion to exclusion about how these communities were set up and why is it that now the problem is the black problem, when in actual fact we didn't set up these communities. We live there, but we've got to address those things. So they're broader things. Many of you will hear people like Tom and others talk about the importance of housing. So I'm not going to go in and unpack it, but we know that it has a significant impact on employment and participating in the economy. We know it has a lot to do with health and certainly around stable tertiary education and high school education and potentially tertiary education. Tom highlighted a few of those in some documents that he had up earlier. So I won't go in and unpack it, but there's a big significance around getting housing right for First Nations people. Importantly, a lot of the stuff that we talk around is around self-determination. So for some of you in this room who aren't familiar with the term of self-determination, in a real simple way, it's about us being in control of our own destiny. Now, probably a lot of white people think, oh, I do that already. But for us, it's a concept that we've had for a really long time, and that's to be in control of our own affairs. So we don't necessarily want to be, looked after by particular people and told what to do. We want to do it our way. That then applies to a whole range of things. To our organisations, about how we want to run our organisations, about what we want to fund and what we don't want to fund, all those sort of things. So it makes a big difference, but it's a really important piece that people understand that self-determination is a foundation of any of the work that we do. So even when we partner with people, it's still around the notion of self-determination, that we're in control of our destiny and we're not going to be told by our partner what we need to do. And that's not a bad thing. It's just something that sometimes is really poorly understood and causes major grief when we get to the stage where we're sitting at a table trying to make decisions, when the master and slave really comes out in those relationships, where who wants to be in control steps up, and it's generally not the Indigenous partner. So we've got to work through that and understand it. And certainly we want to have a say in how our First Nations housing services and services provided to our people are done. Now, earlier you heard a couple of pieces that were put forward by Tom, and others talk about this also. We have some really key documents around in this country that talk about the notion, and their words around really important things, and they're more than words, I would say, that they're a commitment to improving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing outcomes. But the reality is that if the measures aren't right, and that is the targets that we put in place aren't right, we're not going to make a big difference. So I can sit here and say that we need 100 or 200,000 houses, but the reality is if the measure is only 1,000 houses per year, you can see where there's a massive disconnect. So we've got to work through what some of these commitments are and whether or not they're made in the best interest, or if they're made in the economic climate that suits the government of the day. And if it is, we've got to understand that and but look at it from a different point of view and say, what is it that we need as opposed to what can be funded? And this is one of the challenges that many of us have had to deal with working in public service, that we've got an intent to make change, but we haven't got the resources. So there's got to be better ways for us to look at it. The other thing that I want to talk about when it comes to some of these key documents is who's being held accountable. There's forever and a day in my working life, and I joined the public service in the 80s, that I have seen the Commonwealth take responsibility for stuff and then pass it on to the states, and then the states and territories take responsibility or pass it on to the Commonwealth. And that's a real challenge when it comes to anything that we do in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing, because we want to know who's got skin in the game, who's funding what, who's not doing it, whose responsibility, and be very clear so every stakeholder knows that. So I don't get a mayor over here going to the state and the state saying, oh, it's a Commonwealth responsibility, and the Commonwealth saying, oh, sorry, you've got to go back to your state department, because we know that that sort of stuff happens across the country and not just in Queensland. So we've got to address those things. And the issue is that sometimes when we put targets together, the targets aren't necessarily addressing the actual issue. And I'll use the issue of overcrowding as a point. Overcrowding, for many of us who are purists, can understand that overcrowding can be simply fixed by more dwellings. As we have more dwellings, we have more people, have more space and less numbers of people in houses, right? But for some unknown reason, that's been lost in translation. And there's a lot of stuff that's pointing out the Aboriginal person's the problem here, because they go into houses, they wreck houses. Why would we put any more houses into a community? Why would we address the thing of overcrowding? Blackfellas love to live together like that, all that sort of stuff. So we've got a real issue that we've got to unpack and address and call out the nonsense when we hear it and the mistruths. All right. So I put this up for a reason, okay? And the reality is many of you will look at this slide and ask yourself, where are we in this journey for improving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing outcomes? And the reality is we're probably closer to this end of the spectrum. We're still going through a stage where we're hitting the rough patch. While we've made progress over the last 30, 40 years, we haven't even hit the problem areas yet, right? And this is what we're trying to address. So when we talk about this issue of urgency, it's going to be a long time, and I'll probably be pretty old by the time we get to the other side of that hump if we get there. But the reality is we've got so much to get through at the moment that we haven't even hit the difficulty part yet, because I haven't even touched and unpacked for you the issues of the people who live in poverty, the people who are going through rental stress, the people who won't ever own a home, and all those stuff before we even get over that hurdle. So it's not all doom and gloom. There's progress being made, and we've got to stop sometimes and take a recheck. But there's a lot of people older than me in this room, and I'm in my 50s, that we've got to have this conversation about reality, is about how quickly can we get there, as opposed to let's just accept that this is what we did in the 60s, this is what we did in the 70s, this is where we got to the 90s, and this is where we are in 2020. It doesn't work that way. We've got a lot of learnings. So it takes me to the point where I want to finish on, which is this issue of exclusion to inclusion. So a lot of things have happened over a long period of time. And I'm going to start back with the first point up there around this whole issue around colonisation and its impact. Now, people see an end product here. And for some of us who have worked in public health and other areas, generally the patients that we're dealing with, we're seeing the end product of something that's happened over a long period of time. When they present, it's not that just they've been sick for a short period of time, it's happened over a long period of time. The stuff that we're dealing with has got a really strong tie to government policy of the day. Now, while we don't have those policies of the day, it's had significant impact over a long period of time. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been historically excluded from housing. It changed, and it changed in the late 1960s and early 70s, and I'll tell you why it changed. But this is significant to us and for us to always remember. So the stuff that people are dealing with and the consequences of it come from back then. It has direct impacts on families. It's called family breakdown. It's called mistrust in society, mistrust in authority, mistrust in government, right? And we're dealing with that now as we're trying to deal with housing, right? The 1967 referendum was an interesting one, because for a lot of people in this room, very few people who are First Nations people, would have had an opportunity to own a house pre-1967. And I can even go back as far as returned servicemen from the Second World War who were Indigenous, who were not given parcels of land like the people that they stood beside in service. So we've seen a lot of discrimination over a long time. If you had a house probably in the 60s, you might have bought it for around $9,000, maybe a little bit less. That house today would be probably worth $1 million. If we use a formula, houses generally compound every 10 years, they double. So we're seeing a lot of stuff where people have missed out on opportunities to either be in the housing and own houses or create and accumulate wealth. Now, pre-1967, yep, we had people in the workforce, of course we did. Were wages equal? Not generally. So we had another issue around wage parity and other issues that impacted on people, and also their ability to acquire and accumulate assets. However, things did change, and it's probably in 1970s that we started seeing a real change. The 1960s, certainly by the late 1960s, we started seeing money that was made available through the Australian government around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing in this country. And some of that was really basic stuff that went into areas that we would know as missions or reserves. We'd always had some states or territories that would fund those operations, or mission groups that would fund those. But really the Australian government started to fund some programs that were deliberately put in place to improve housing prospects for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. However, their approach hasn't always worked the way that we wanted it to work. From the 1990s, we've started seeing a number of programs for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people around housing. And a lot of those generally focused on this issue of overcrowding that we're still trying to grapple with today in 2024. And those programs were tied to particular policy agendas at the time. So whether it was the Northern Territory Emergency Response, where we saw a big bucket of money go in around housing, whether it was some of the early Closing the Gap stuff, where we saw money go in, it was generally tied to that. And it was because we didn't lobby enough While we had organisations like Aboriginal hostels and others that were providing housing solutions, the real issues that we need to address around that time, like home ownership and stuff, we didn't have enough work being done around it. We had economic development commissions, a whole range of other things that were doing some wonderful stuff pre-IBA, but we really did not see any need to do a lot of work in that area. And it was only for people like Tom and other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who were in key roles in those times that we saw some traction. From 2008 to 2018, and ATSIC, of course, yes. ATSIC played a role until their demise in 2005. But certainly we had people who were pushing things, but once again, they were Indigenous groups, Indigenous cohorts or Indigenous leaders who were pushing it. It wasn't a mainstream thing to see an improvement in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing. And for the few who we did have, we called them, they were on our side. From 2008 to 2018, then we started seeing a bit of a change. States and territories started working together. We saw the rollout of a housing program called Napari that I managed here in Queensland, a big investment that we probably won't ever see again. But those sort of things came into play. And then in more recent years, that'll take us through to 31, probably as far as 34, to be honest. We're going to see some stuff that's tied around closing the gap agreement. So those agreements that are in place, the joint council that Tom had mentioned about, all those sort of things, we have to advocate and lead these discussions around what is actually needed to improve Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing in this country. Yeah. While we're excluded, more recent times we've been included. The reason why I said 67 was important is home ownership since 67 has started to grow for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. From the 1970s, for people who may not be familiar with it, we saw changes in national laws around discrimination, which meant that particular states and territories couldn't hold Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on missions or reserves anymore, which meant that those people were free to move around the country. So some of you in this room would have been born in the 70s, if not pre-70s, so you'll understand how recent this history is. So the idea of everyone owning homes and that, there's a reason for it. Well, we haven't got it. Look, I'm going to finish off on a couple of key points that I just want everyone to think about. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people want access to housing that is suitable, right? They don't want to be told that they're going to have to live in something that's going to have structural damage and it's going to be a crap place to live in the next 5 years because we've made a decision to build something cheap, to put on this parcel of land because they're black fellas, out of mind, out of sight. We want something better than that, and we expect something better than that. Housing is important to all First Nations people. It's empowering. It's the sort of stuff that can help us set up our families, can give us some stability in life. It can give us access to local schools. It can give us access to local employment opportunities so we don't have to move around. For people who want to explore tertiary education, it can do that. But it's got a lot of benefits and we don't have to unpack all of those. Importantly, the way that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people experience the housing system is different to non-Indigenous people. And it goes back to my point about racism, about access to housing, right? There will be a black person in here at every table who could tell you a story about discrimination in the housing market of one way or another. It may not be government, it may not be a real estate agent, but they will tell you what they've experienced. So until that conversation is no longer existent, we've got a problem. And that problem is outside of our control. It's not a problem for black people to fix. It's a problem for non-Indigenous brothers and sisters to fix, for us to make it a better environment so people don't feel like there's a two-class system in this country. And the last one that I just want to talk about is that there is an overrepresentation, as I said in those early slides, in a whole range of areas. And that should not be acceptable in this country. We can find money to fund foreign aid. We can find money at elections to put notices out that we're going to do something. We can find money to put other things in critical infrastructure in place. We can find money in a natural disaster that may happen in our country where we get donations and other things in. There's got to be a solution to fixing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing in this country, and I'm glad that we're here talking about it today. The last thing that I just want to finish on is this slide. Issues like homelessness, really high. There's a number of underlying factors that have contributed to the letdown in the housing system and things that we can control and can't control. Poor housing and future poor housing will continue to have an impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And while there's a trend around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing and everyone's talking about it and want to be involved and want to fix it, the reality is unless we have some really ambitious targets in place, as we do for the Housing Accord and for other things, we will never get to the place we need to get to in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing. So I've got to emphasise that every time you hear a conversation, a catchphrase, a commitment, ask what is that number? What does it look like? If it cost me $100 billion to build 20,000 houses in Australia, what do you think it's going to cost us to improve Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing in this country? So that's for 100,000 houses as an example. We're talking about billions of dollars here. The commitments that we see for a couple of million here, hundreds of millions here, 1 billion here, is not going to help us achieve what we need to achieve in this country to improve Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing. And then, on top of that, we've got the issue that Julie had spoken about around the crises that the Minister talks about, which is supply is an issue, right? Affordability is an issue. Labour is an issue. And we've got to address all those. But we've got solutions in some of our Indigenous communities to fix those, and I'm hoping that we catch that in our next session. Cool? All right, thank you.
Thank you. Julie, can I just for a quick few minutes invite you back up onto the stage with Neil? We don't have a great deal of time, but I really wanted to open the floor to see if there was any questions for either Julie or Neil, just on the topic of the current state of affairs for First Nations housing. If we can keep our questions really prompt and brief, that would be great. Does anybody have anything they'd like to ask? Just raise your hand for me. Surely there has to be one question. Oh, thanks, Neil.
I just wanted to ask a question around native title. With a lot of land now being given back to traditional owners, and I suppose the question is both Danielle and yourself as well, is that how do you see in the future in regards to, because I've travelled around in my ward and I've heard the community as well as the elders saying we want to build houses on our land. And, there are things like compensation, for instance, because a lot of our people have been removed from their traditional country. But in saying that, somebody has to take some responsibilities in terms of the traditional owners are now wanting to develop their land in regards to housing. But in the other hand, in regards to local government, then local government needs to ensure that town planning and zoning has to be in conjunction with native title as well. Thank you.
Yeah, a great summary of the issue, I think, in itself around that tension and, I suppose, collaboration opportunity between the statutory obligations of the local government, but also recognising the rights and the requests from the relevant Indigenous parties that have control over that land. And there's a range of, I suppose, tenure and legal structures around that that you need to, I suppose, follow. But I've seen some good examples at the moment where they're actually collaborating to achieve those outcomes. There are still the issues of, what we call constraints like flooding, environmental, all those sorts of things that need to be worked through, and respectfully acknowledging, I suppose, how country is managed and having a more flexible approach around that. I think the maturity of local governments is different, and you get those different experiences depending on local politics, willingness, those sorts of things. So it is tricky in the sense of making sure that that planning scheme does get modified to make sure it recognises the land use agreement that's in place. But there are the statutory mechanisms, and it's about working collaboratively.
Great presentations. Is that on? Yep.
Yep.
I'll be making sure I get a copy of them, of course. Julie, with your one and what has been a concern historically, amongst all the things, including the things that Neil put up there, and the current investment that's been made and the challenge that state and the Commonwealth Government have got around the targets. And I know people with their own homes that would be struggling to get someone to come and fix a door or a leaking tap because there's so much work around. And the thing that really concerns me and has for quite a number of years is the QA system or the quality assurance system that is used or abused or not used at all in the rollout of capital works programs and the shoddy work historically that has occurred in our communities, in our housing, and when is it going to stop? And how are they going to control it in each state and territory when on the one hand they're rushing to roll out and meet all these targets, and then we've experienced time and time again, and the further out you go obviously to rural and remote, the worse it gets. And the high cost which was highlighted. So you're paying 10 times more for a much lesser product that you're getting. It's just an ongoing thing that never seems to get addressed.
I'm not a quality assurance or building sort of expert, but I do know those funding programs are requiring certain levels of accreditation and quality, and I think the federal minister has said, we don't want crap built as part of the program delivery. So it is about if we are, investing significant, unprecedented amounts into this space, we want to create great places, and that's a critical component of the success of the program. In saying that, when funding crowds into a space, people who are in the system, I suppose, try and maximise the opportunity out of it. And it's ensuring that there's appropriate checks and balances with those funding programs. And my exposure to date in participating in them is that they're quite high, and particularly at that federal level, around the type of accreditation you need. I do think, though, touching on your point around rural and remote, that there needs to be better innovation in that space around the delivery opportunities, and we need strong government support. The market's just not going to deliver that into those communities, and so it does need a different laneway and a different type of approach, but even considering some of what we call the modern methods of construction and looking at some innovation in delivery that capacity builds for training in local communities as well. I went on a recent tour to America that looked at modern methods of construction, and most of the workforce that were at those facilities had no trade qualifications. There were many that came out of incarceration, were migrants or refugee history backgrounds, but had the right skills in that type of environment to participate and had some great successes out of it. So I think there's some learnings there as well. The other thing, I do think that maintenance program, and I know Danielle spoke about the great commitment that's about to be rolled out for maintenance and improvements, but if you look at stock at the moment, and it's hard to build anything new, so let's maximise the opportunities of existing stock and make sure that we can use that as well is critically important.